"This table is available right this way." He said it without looking at them, not at Marcus Tillman, not at his wife, Diane. He said it the way a person says something they have already decided, something that does not require the courtesy of eye contact, and he gestured with 2 fingers toward the back of the room as though the motion itself were a favor. The table was beside the bathroom door, not near it, beside it. Close enough that the hinge brushed the back of a chair every time the door swung open. Close enough that the ventilation fan above the frame pushed a faint chemical warmth across the tablecloth. The restaurant was called Ardmore, and it was the kind of place where the lighting was low and amber and deliberate, where the tables near the windows were dressed with fresh-cut flowers and the kind of silence that signals expense. Those tables were occupied, some by couples who had arrived after the Tillmans, some by people who had not yet been seated when the Tillmans walked through the door, but those people had been guided to the window side, to the flower side, to the quiet side. Marcus Tillman stood still for a moment. He was a tall man with a measured stillness about him, the kind of stillness that is not passivity but discipline. And he looked at the table by the bathroom door, and then he looked at the room, and then he looked at the man who had led them there. The man's name was Gerald Fitch. He owned Ardmore. He had owned it for 11 years. He had already turned away. The dining room was not empty. 12 tables were occupied, a party of 4 near the window, a couple celebrating something, a small wrapped box on the table between them. A woman dining alone, a notebook open beside her water glass, a pen resting in the crease. None of them said anything. The hostess at the front stand looked at her reservation book. A busboy near the service station kept his eyes on the silverware he was rolling. Dead silence. What Gerald Fitch did not know was who was sitting at the table beside him. Not Marcus Tillman, though that name alone would have been enough. He did not know about the woman with the notebook. He did not know what she had written in it. He did not know that she had been watching the entire exchange from the moment the Tillmans walked through the door, and that she had written down the time, the table number, and the 2-word instruction Fitch had used to dismiss them. He did not know that by the following morning, every one of those details would be in print. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. Now, here is what most people did not know about Marcus Tillman. He had grown up in a narrow house on Clement Street in a part of Atlanta where the sidewalks buckled and the corner stores stayed open past midnight because the people who lived there worked hours that did not conform to daylight. His mother, Evelyn Tillman, had worked the breakfast shift at a diner called Lula's for 22 years. She wore the same white uniform 5 days a week, pressed it every Sunday night on a board she kept in the hallway, and she had a way of moving through a dining room that suggested she understood something about hospitality that most people who owned restaurants never would. She taught Marcus 2 things before he was old enough to drive. The first, that the quality of a meal was not measured in the food alone, but in the dignity of the person eating it. The second, that the people who were treated as though they did not matter were often the ones who understood the room better than anyone in it. "You stay low," she told him once, pressing his school shirt flat with the heel of her hand, "and you build high, and when they finally look up, they'll already be standing in what you built." Marcus had taken that with him. He had taken it to culinary school in New Orleans, where he graduated at the top of his class in 1998. He had taken it to a series of kitchens in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, where he cooked under 3 James Beard award-winning chefs and learned the grammar of fine dining from the inside out. Not from the dining room, but from the flame and the steel in the 6-hour stock. He had taken it into the investment that he and Diane had made quietly, deliberately, over 14 years. A restaurant group called Tillman Hospitality, which by 2019 operated 7 restaurants across 4 cities, including a tasting menu destination in Washington, D.C., that had held 2 Michelin stars for 3 consecutive years. He had never put his photograph on the website. He had never sought a profile in a food magazine. He moved in silence. He built in silence. And on a Saturday evening in October, he and Diane drove 40 minutes from their hotel to have dinner at Ardmore, because a colleague had mentioned the kitchen and Marcus was always curious about other people's work. He was not there to be seen. He was there to eat. What Gerald Fitch saw when the Tillmans walked in was something else entirely, something he had already categorized before they reached the host's stand. He saw it in the way his chin lifted slightly, the way his hand moved to the reservation book not to check it, but to delay, the way his eyes moved across Marcus and Diane and arrived at a conclusion that had nothing to do with their reservation, which was confirmed under the name Tillman for 7:30 p.m. Now, here is what Gerald Fitch's world looked like from the inside. Ardmore had been written up in the city magazine twice. It had a 4-star rating on the platform that mattered to the kind of people Fitch wanted in his dining room, and Fitch had a specific image of who those people were. He had cultivated it carefully. The lighting, the wine list, the tablecloths that were changed between every seating. He had a regular table for a city councilman near the bar. He had a standing reservation for the managing partner of a downtown law firm every 3rd Thursday. He knew their names. He knew their drinks. He greeted them at the door with both hands and the particular warmth that a person reserves for people they consider worth warming. He was 54 years old. He had bought Ardmore with a loan from his father-in-law and had spent 11 years building it into something he considered a reflection of himself. He used the word curated often. He used the word clientele the way other people use the word family. He believed, genuinely and without examination, that the room he had built was a certain kind of room for a certain kind of person, and that his instincts about who belonged where were simply good management. He did not think of it as bias. He never had. He thought of it as taste. And that certainty, that unexamined, unchallenged certainty, was the most dangerous thing in the room that night. Because seated 4 tables away from the Tillmans, at a small 2-top near the east wall with a clear sight line to both the entrance and the back of the dining room, was a woman named Claudia Voss. Claudia Voss had been a restaurant critic for 17 years. She had written for 3 national publications and currently held the critic's chair at the Meridian, a food and culture journal with a readership of 340,000, and a reputation for criticism that was precise, unsparing, and widely read by the people who made decisions in the hospitality industry. She had reviewed 614 restaurants. She had given 11 of them the journal's highest rating. She had also, on 4 occasions, written what her editor called the other kind of review, the kind that did not concern itself with the food at all. She had a reservation under the name Voss. She had arrived 12 minutes before the Tillmans. She had been given a table near the east wall without ceremony, which was how she preferred it, and she had ordered a glass of sparkling water and opened the small notebook she carried everywhere, the kind with the black cloth cover and unlined pages. She had written 3 notes before the Tillmans arrived: the temperature of the bread, the timing of the amuse-bouche, the way the server had described the evening's specials with genuine fluency, which she noted as a positive, a sign of a kitchen that briefed its floor staff. Then the front door opened. She did not look up immediately. She heard the sound of the door, the brief intrusion of street air, and then she heard the particular quality of silence that follows a greeting that does not happen. She looked up. She saw Marcus and Diane Tillman standing at the host stand. She saw Gerald Fitch approach them. She watched the exchange. She watched the two-fingered gesture toward the back of the room. She watched the Tillmans follow, and she watched where they were led. She picked up her pen. She wrote, 7:41 p.m. Black couple. Reservation confirmed. She could see the book from where she sat, had watched Fitch's finger find the name. Seated at table 14, bathroom adjacent. No flowers, no window. 2 tables near the window opened in the preceding 6 minutes, both given to white couples who arrived after. She underlined the last sentence. She did not close the notebook. The dining room settled back into its amber quiet. The couple near the window laughed at something. The wrapped gift sat between them, patient. Gerald Fitch moved through the room with the ease of a man who believed everything was in its proper place. Marcus Tillman sat down across from his wife. He placed his napkin in his lap. He looked at the menu. He did not look at the bathroom door, though it opened twice in the first 4 minutes and the draft crossed the back of his neck both times. Diane reached across the table and touched his hand, briefly, and he met her eyes, and something passed between them that required no words because they had been married for 19 years and some things do not need language. He never raised his voice. He said nothing to Gerald Fitch. He did not call the manager because the manager was the owner, and the owner had made his decision with the confidence of a man who expected no consequence. But across the dining room, Claudia Voss was still writing. She wrote about the bread, which arrived warm and was genuinely good. She wrote about the sea scallop starter, which was properly seared and served with a parsnip puree that showed real technique. She wrote about the duck, which she ordered as her main, and which arrived at the correct temperature with a cherry reduction that was balanced and not overly sweet. The kitchen, she noted, was capable. The kitchen, she noted, was doing serious work. And then she wrote about the room. She wrote about the way the room was divided, not by a wall, not by a partition, by a decision made at the host stand that some guests were window guests and some guests were bathroom guests, and that the sorting appeared to have nothing to do with reservation time or party size or any logistical necessity she could identify, and everything to do with who was walking through the door. She wrote it carefully. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, with specificity, with evidence, and without a single adjective that could not be defended. She had written 214 words in her notebook before her duck arrived. She had written 31 of them about the food. Gerald Fitch came to her table once near the end of her meal. He did not know who she was. He had met her once, years ago, at an industry event, but he had not retained her face, which was something Claudia Voss had learned to cultivate deliberately. She wore no press badge. She made no notes in his presence. She ordered a dessert, a pear tart that was technically precise and emotionally inert, and she wrote that down too. "Everything to your satisfaction?" Fitch asked her, and he smiled the smile of a man who already knew the answer. "The kitchen is doing excellent work," she said. 5 words. She did not elaborate. He thanked her and moved on, satisfied. He had no idea. Marcus and Diane Tillman finished their meal. The food had been good. Marcus had noted the scallop, had noted the duck, had thought about the reduction and what he might have done differently with the acid balance. He was always thinking about the food. It was the habit of a man who had spent 30 years in kitchens, who understood what it took to produce a plate like that, who had genuine respect for the work even when the room that surrounded it did not extend the same respect to him. They paid their bill. They left a 22% tip because Diane believed that the server's conduct should be evaluated separately from the owner's, and the server had been attentive and warm, and had not once made them feel like the table they were sitting at was an afterthought. They walked out into the October air. Diane took Marcus's arm. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet after something like this, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to carry certain things without putting them down in public. "Good duck," he said. Diane laughed quietly, and they walked to the car. In the restaurant behind them, Gerald Fitch was already thinking about the following week's reservations. He was thinking about the councilman's standing table. He was thinking about a new wine he wanted to add to the list. He was thinking about Ardmore, and what it was, and who it was for. He was not thinking about Claudia Voss, who was still at her table, her notebook open, her pen moving. He was not thinking about the 31 words she had already written about his dining room. He had no idea what was coming, and it was about to arrive by morning. The morning came the way October mornings do in that city, gray at the edges, the air carrying the first real bite of cold, the kind of cold that reminds you that the easy season is finished. Claudia Voss was at her desk by 6:15. She had slept 4 hours, which was more than she usually slept after a review dinner, because the review dinners that required the most writing were not always the ones with the most food. She had drafted the piece in her head on the drive home. She had refined it in the 30 minutes before sleep finally arrived. And by the time she opened her laptop in the pale morning light, with a cup of coffee cooling beside her keyboard and the black notebook open to the page she had filled the night before, the piece was already formed. She only needed to find its shape on the screen. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote about the bread, which she described as one of the finest she had encountered in a restaurant at this price point in 3 years of reviewing in this city. She wrote about the scallop and the parsnip puree with the precision of someone who had eaten 10,000 restaurant meals and still found language for each one. She wrote about the duck, and she gave it its due, and she named the cherry reduction and the acid balance and the temperature and the technique, because the kitchen deserved that, and Claudia Voss had never, in 17 years of criticism, withheld what was earned. And then she wrote about the room. She wrote it in 4 paragraphs. She wrote it without adjectives she could not defend. She wrote it with the timestamps she had recorded, the table numbers she had observed, the sequence of seatings she had watched from her position near the east wall. She named no names in those 4 paragraphs. She did not need to. The specificity was its own indictment. The facts arranged themselves into a shape that any reader with working eyes would recognize. She sent the piece to her editor, Raymond Chu, at 8:43 in the morning. She included a note, 3 sentences long, explaining what she had witnessed and confirming that she had documentation in her notebook. She told him she considered the piece ready to publish. Raymond Chu called her at 9:07. He had read it twice. She could tell from the quality of his silence when she answered. He was a careful man, a former reporter who had spent 20 years learning the difference between what you felt and what you could prove, and he had the instinct of someone who had been sued twice and won both times because he had never published a word he could not defend in a deposition. "The food section is solid," he said. "The other section is airtight." He paused. "You're sure about the sequence?" "I wrote it down as it happened," she said. "Times, tables, party composition. It's in the notebook." Another pause, then, "I'm going to call legal. We'll publish by noon." The piece ran at 11:58 a.m. The headline was not sensational. It was not designed to be. The Meridian did not do sensational headlines. It read, "Ardmore's kitchen earns its stars. Its dining room does not." The subheading was 7 words, a critic's account of a divided room. By 2 in the afternoon, it had been shared 4,000 times. By 4, it had been shared 19,000 times. By 6, the number was past 40,000, and 3 other publications had linked to it, and 2 of them had called Ardmore for comment, and Ardmore had not yet responded, because Gerald Fitch had spent the afternoon on the phone with his attorney and had not issued a statement, which was itself a kind of statement. The piece did not mention Marcus Tillman by name. It did not need to. It described a couple, a reservation confirmed in the book, a table beside the bathroom door, and a sequence of seatings that could not be explained by logistics. It described what Claudia Voss had seen with her own eyes from 4 tables away, and it described it with the particular authority of someone who had spent 17 years learning to see dining rooms as systems, as architectures of welcome and exclusion, as places where the most important decisions were often made before anyone sat down. That was the piece. That was all it was. It was enough. Now, here's what most people did not know about the days that followed. Marcus Tillman read the piece on Sunday morning. Diane had found it first, had set her phone on the kitchen table without saying anything, and he had picked it up and read it standing at the counter, still in his clothes from the previous night's walk, still holding the mug of coffee he had poured before she came in. He read it once. He set the phone down. He picked up his coffee. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the window above the sink, at the gray October light coming through it, at the oak tree in the yard that had already begun to shed. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "She got the duck right." Diane looked at him. He was smiling, very slightly, the way a man smiles when something lands exactly where it should. He did not call anyone. He did not post anything. He did not give an interview that day or the day after or the day after that. He went back to work. He had a kitchen to run and a staff that needed him, and a Monday lunch service that would not wait for anyone's vindication. He stayed low. He built high. The calls, however, came to him. They came through the publicist he had never needed to use much, a woman named Patricia Wells who had represented Tillman Hospitality for 6 years, and who had spent most of that time fielding quiet industry inquiries rather than media storms. By Monday afternoon, Patricia had calls from 4 journalists, 2 television producers, a documentary filmmaker, and the editor of a national food magazine who wanted to know if Marcus Tillman would sit for a profile. He declined all of them. Patricia called him at 4:30 on Monday and said simply, "They're not going to stop." "I know," he said. "Let them write what they need to write. We'll be here when they're done." She had worked with enough people in this industry to know that most of them would not have said that. Most of them would have been on the phone within the hour, managing the narrative, positioning the story, making sure their name was attached to the right version of events. Marcus Tillman was not most people. He had been building something for 14 years in near total silence, and he was not going to let a single Saturday night in October turn him into someone who needed to be seen. He had his mother's voice in his ear. He always did. Stay low, build high, and when they finally look up, they'll already be standing in what you built. The piece, meanwhile, had taken on a life that Claudia Voss had not anticipated and Raymond Chu had not fully predicted, though he had known it was possible. The restaurant industry responded first, and it responded with the particular speed of a community that understood exactly what the piece was describing, because most of the people in it had seen it before, had experienced it before, had absorbed it, and moved on because there was no other option. Chefs wrote about it. Restaurateurs wrote about it. A James Beard Award committee member posted a statement saying the piece raised questions that the industry had an obligation to examine. And then the civic response arrived. The city's Human Rights Commission opened an inquiry. Not an investigation, not yet. An inquiry. A formal letter sent to Ardmore requesting records, reservation logs, seating charts, table assignment protocols for the preceding 18 months. The letter was signed by the Commission's director, a woman named Dr. Adayeze Okafor, who had held the position for 4 years and who had a reputation for moving carefully and without theater. Gerald Fitch received the letter on Tuesday morning. He read it standing in his office behind the bar with the restaurant dark and the chairs still up on the tables. He had been there since 7, which was earlier than he usually came in because he had not been sleeping well. He had been reading the coverage. He had been watching the share count. He had been waiting for it to pass, the way these things sometimes passed, the way attention moved on to the next thing. It had not passed. He set the letter on the bar. He called his attorney. His attorney told him to produce the records and say nothing publicly until they had reviewed the documents together. His attorney told him that the records would either support his position or they would not, and that they needed to know which before they said anything. Gerald Fitch already knew which. He had not kept formal seating charts. He had never needed to, or so he had believed. The decisions at the host stand had always been his decisions, made in the moment, made by feel, made with the instinct of a man who believed his instincts were simply good management. There were no written protocols. There was no documented system. There was only the pattern, and the pattern, laid out across 18 months of reservation logs and cross-referenced with table assignments, told a story that no attorney could make disappear. The Human Rights Commission's inquiry became a formal investigation 6 weeks later. The investigator assigned to the case was a man named Thomas Reyes, a former civil rights attorney who had joined the commission 3 years earlier and who had a particular skill for building administrative cases out of patterns rather than incidents. He did not need a single smoking gun moment. He needed the weight of repetition, and the records gave him that. The records showed what Claudia Voss had seen from 4 tables away on a single Saturday evening. They showed it across 73 reservation evenings. They showed it in the aggregate, in the pattern, in the numbers that do not lie, even when the man who made the decisions tells himself he was only following his instincts. Thomas Reyes had seen that argument before. He had heard it in depositions and in hearings and in the particular exhausted voice of people who had spent years doing something without ever once examining what they were doing or why. He did not find it persuasive. The investigation moved through the winter, and in that same winter something else was moving, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with the commission or the coverage or the 40,000 shares. Inside Ardmore's own dining room, among the staff who had worked there for years and who had watched the host stand every night and who had their own observations, their own discomforts, their own silences that had accumulated over time, something was shifting. One of them had already decided to speak. Her name was Renata Osi. She had worked as a server at Ardmore for 3 years. She was 29 years old, and she was good at her job, genuinely good. The kind of server who remembered not just the order, but the person, who could read a table's mood in the first 30 seconds and calibrate accordingly. She had watched the host stand for 3 years. She had watched the pattern that Thomas Reyes would later hot in the records. She had watched it and said nothing, because she needed the job and because she had told herself, the way people tell themselves things when the alternative is unbearable, that she was not certain enough to say something, that she might be wrong, that it might be her imagination. The piece in the Meridian told her she was not wrong. She called the commission on the Monday after the piece ran. She spoke to a staff attorney for 40 minutes. She described what she had observed over 3 years in specific and careful terms with dates she had begun keeping in her own phone after the first year because something in her had known, even then, that the record mattered. She gave them 47 dates. She gave them descriptions. She gave them the pattern from the inside, from the floor of the dining room, from the perspective of someone who had been standing in it every night. Thomas Reyes added her account to the file, and the file grew heavier. Renata Osei still had her job at Ardmore when the investigation concluded. She had not been fired, not because Gerald Fitch did not know she had spoken, but because his attorney had told him, in terms that required no interpretation, that terminating a cooperating witness during an active administrative investigation would be the single most catastrophic decision he could make. So she kept her job, and she kept her dignity, and she kept coming to work every night with the particular composure of someone who has done the right thing and is still waiting for the world to catch up. She had not done it for recognition. She had not done it for reward. She had done it because she had watched that dining room for 3 years, and she had watched what it cost the people who were led to the wrong tables, and she had decided, finally, that the cost of her silence was higher than the cost of her speaking. That was all. That was enough. The file was nearly complete, and Gerald Fitch was about to find out what it contained. The formal finding arrived on a Thursday morning in February, 4 months after a Saturday night in October when Gerald Fitch had gestured with 2 fingers toward the back of a room and believed, with the full certainty of a man who had never once been made to examine himself, that he was simply managing his dining room. The Human Rights Commission's finding was 23 pages long. Thomas Reyes had written it with the same precision he brought to every case, not with heat, not with theater, but with the accumulated weight of evidence arranged so carefully that it required no interpretation. The finding documented a pattern of racially disparate seating practices at Ardmore spanning 73 reservation evenings over 18 months. It cited reservation logs. It cited table assignment records. It cited the testimony of a server who had stood on that floor for 3 years and had finally, at great personal cost, told the truth about what she had seen. It cited the account of a restaurant critic who had been seated 4 tables away on a Saturday evening in October and had written it all down. The finding recommended a fine of $60,000, mandatory staff training, a supervised seating audit for a period of 12 months, and the public posting of the Commission's determination in Ardmore's dining room for 90 days. 90 days in the dining room, where the councilman's table was, where the managing partner came every 3rd Thursday, where the tablecloths were changed between every seating and the lighting was low and amber and deliberate, and Gerald Fitch had spent 11 years building something he considered a reflection of himself. He had 30 days to respond. He did not contest the finding. His attorney advised against it, and for once in 11 years of trusting his own instincts over everyone else's counsel, Gerald Fitch listened. He did not contest it because the records were the records, and the record said what they said, and no argument he could make would change what 73 evenings of documented pattern looked like when laid out in 23 pages by a former civil rights attorney who had spent 3 years learning to build cases out of exactly this kind of evidence. He paid the fine. He accepted the audit. He ordered the framed determination from the commission's office, and he watched it go up on the wall of his dining room, near the host stand, where every person who walked through the door would see it before they were seated. He did not attend the hanging of the frame. He sent his general manager. That was in March. In April, the city magazine that had written about Ardmore twice, that had given it 4 stars and described it as one of the finest dining experiences in the city, ran a follow-up piece. It was not a review. It was a reported story, and it named Gerald Fitch by name, and it named the commission's finding, and it quoted the findings' language directly. It quoted Claudia Voss's original piece. It quoted, briefly and with attribution, a server who had worked the floor for 3 years and had finally spoken. Renata Osei was named in that piece. She had agreed to be named. She had thought about it for a long time, and then she had decided that the anonymity she had been given was something she could choose to release, because her name was not a liability. It was a record. It was evidence that someone had stood in that room and seen what was happening, and had chosen, at real cost, to say so. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, she had received 42 messages from people in the restaurant industry, servers, cooks, hosts, managers, who had read her account and written to say that they had seen the same thing in other rooms in other cities and had not known what to do with it. She read every one of them. She kept working at Ardmore through the spring, through the supervised audit, through the 90 days the commission's determination hung on the wall near the host stand. She was professional. She was composed. She was exactly who she had always been, which was someone who understood the room she was standing in and chose every night to do her job with care. In June, she gave her notice. She had been offered a position as front-of-house manager at a new restaurant opening in the fall, a place run by a chef who had read the city magazine piece and had called the number at the bottom of it and asked if she would be willing to have a conversation. The chef's name was Marcus Tillman. He had not sought her out for the story. He had sought her out because he had read the city magazine piece, and he had read what she had done, and he understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where the right decision was often the costly one, exactly what it had taken for her to do it. He offered her the position at the end of a 40-minute conversation in which he asked her about her philosophy of hospitality, her approach to floor management, and what she believed a dining room owed to the people who walked into it. She told him everything. A dining room owed its guests everything, not just the food, not just the service, the full weight of being seen. He hired her on the spot. The new restaurant opened in September. It was called Clement, after the street in Atlanta where Marcus Tillman had grown up, where the sidewalks buckled and the corner stores stayed open past midnight, and a woman named Evelyn had pressed a school shirt flat with the heel of her hand and told her son to stay low and build high. The name was not explained on the menu. It did not need to be. Claudia Voss reviewed it in November. She gave it the journal's highest rating. She wrote about the food first, the scallop, the duck, the bread, all of it, and she wrote about the room. She wrote that Clement was the finest expression of hospitality she had encountered in 17 years of criticism, not because the food was flawless, though it was close, but because every person who walked through the door was treated as though their presence was the point. She wrote that the front-of-house manager, a woman named Renata Osei, ran the floor with the kind of instinctive grace that cannot be taught, only cultivated, and that the room she managed felt like the kind of room that understood what a dining room was actually for. The review ran on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Clement had a 6-week wait list. Marcus Tillman read the review the same way he had read the first one, standing at the counter, holding his coffee, looking at the window. He read it once. He set the phone down. He picked up his coffee. He stood there for a long moment. Then he called his mother. Evelyn Tillman was 71 years old. She still lived in the narrow house on Clement Street, though the neighborhood around it had changed in the ways that neighborhoods change when the money arrives and the people who built them are gradually pressed to its edges. She had a small garden in the backyard now, tomatoes and collard greens and a fig tree she had planted the year Marcus graduated culinary school, and she spent her mornings out there in the early light, moving through the rows with the same deliberate care she had once moved through the dining room at Lula's. She picked up on the second ring. He told her about the review. He told her about the wait list. He told her about Renata and what she had done and what it had meant. He told her about the name of the restaurant, which she already knew because he had told her when he chose it, and she had been quiet for a long moment on the phone that day before she said, very softly, that she was glad. She was quiet again now, for a moment, on the other end of the line. Then she said, "You stayed low." "I did," he said, "and now look what you built." He looked at the window. The oak tree in the yard had lost its leaves by then, the branches bare and clean against the November sky, and the morning light was the particular thin light of late autumn, honest and without warmth, the kind of light that shows you things exactly as they are. "I had a good teacher," he said. She laughed, quietly, the way his mother had always laughed, not with performance, but with the genuine pleasure of someone who had lived long enough to see the things she had planted finally come to fruit. He stayed on the phone with her for a long time after that. He did not talk about Gerald Fitch. He did not talk about the commission or the finding or the framed determination on the wall of a dining room he had never entered again. He talked about the fig tree. He talked about the collard greens. He talked about what he was planning to put on the winter menu at Clement, and whether she thought a fig reduction would work with duck, and she said she thought it would, and that she had always thought the cherry was a little obvious anyway. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed about any of it. Now, I want to say something directly, because this story is not just about one restaurant on one Saturday evening in October. It is not just about one man and one woman and a table beside a bathroom door and a notebook open on a table 4 seats away. This happens every day. In restaurants and hotels and boardrooms and hospital waiting rooms and rental offices and every other place where one person has the power to decide where another person belongs. It happens in the small gestures. The 2-finger wave toward the back of the room, the hand that reaches for the reservation book, not to check it but to delay, the chin that lifts slightly before the eyes have finished looking. It happens in the accumulation of those gestures, across 73 evenings, across years, across a lifetime of rooms where someone decided, without examination, without evidence, without anything but the unearned certainty of a person who has never been made to question themselves, that some people were window guests and some people were bathroom guests, and the people on the receiving end of those gestures, the people who sit down anyway, who place their napkins in their laps, who order the duck and note the acid balance and leave a 22% tip because the server's conduct should be evaluated separately from the owner's. Those people are carrying something. They carry it without putting it down in public. They carry it with the particular stillness of people who have learned that the world does not always reward the loudest voice. That the most powerful thing you can do in a room that has decided you do not belong is to belong so thoroughly, so undeniably, so quietly and completely that the room eventually has to reckon with what it got wrong. Dignity is not a reward. It is not something you earn by being seen. It is something you carry before anyone looks, and it is still there after they look away. Gerald Fitch built a room. Marcus Tillman built a world. And when the truth finally arrived, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the weight of a notebook and a 23-page finding, and a woman who had stood on a dining room floor for 3 years and finally said what she knew, the difference between those two men became the only thing in the room that mattered. The question I want to leave you with is this. Have you ever been in a room where someone decided, before you opened your mouth, who you were? And have you ever been the one in that room who said nothing? Drop a comment. I want to hear it. Because the stories that change things are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are written in a small notebook on unlined pages, in the handwriting of someone who was paying attention when everyone else had looked away. If you believe those stories deserve to be told, subscribe. Every week we find the people the world overlooked and we tell their stories. This has been one of them.